Hello, and welcome to Divine Resting Place, where we bring you peaceful and faithful tales straight from the Bible. Here, we journey through the timeless stories of Scripture, chapter by chapter, crafted to help you experience deep and restful sleep, all while being surrounded by the comforting words of God. If our stories bring you peace and help you sleep, we'd love for you to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new episode. Be sure to like this video to let us know you enjoyed it, and share it with someone who might need a peaceful night's rest in God's Word. Lastly, we'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from and how these stories are blessing you. Thank you for joining us on this journey of faith and rest. May God's peace be with you tonight and always. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the river bank. Exodus 2, verse 3. In the quiet village of Goshen, the homes of the Israelites whispered with the muffled sounds of life lived in captivity. By the dim glow of a single oil lamp, Jochebed sat at her table, weaving with careful precision. Each strand of bulrushes, supple and green, was tightly bound with a mother's determination. The room smelled faintly of fresh water reeds and the earthy pitch she had prepared earlier that day. The task was sacred. Every thread, every careful fold of the basket's edge carried her prayers for the safety of her son Moses. As the train behind her disappeared, for months, Jochebed had shielded her infant from the cruel decree of Pharaoh. She had hushed his cries and wrapped him close to her heart, a fortress of love against a world that sought his harm. But now, as the days passed and Moses' cries grew stronger, she knew the time had come for a new kind of protection. With each stitch in the basket, she whispered her faith in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Surely, the one who had promised their deliverance would not abandon her child. When the basket was finally complete, she traced its rim with her fingers, marveling at its strength and resilience. She leaned back and sighed deeply, her mind tracing the path she would take to the Nile. The reeds along the riverbank would be her allies, a hiding place for her son. Trusting in God's unseen hand, she prayed for peace to steady her trembling heart. The morning sun filtered softly through the mist that hovered over the Nile River. Its light caught the gentle ripples of the water, turning them into trails of liquid gold. Jochebed walked cautiously, the basket balanced carefully in her arms. Beside her, her daughter Miriam followed silently, her small hands clutching the folds of her mother's robe. The path to the river felt longer than ever, each step a blend of resolve and heartache. As they approached the reeds, the river's quiet hum grew louder, mingling with the rustle of papyrus stalks swaying in the breeze. The river seemed vast and untamable, but to Jochebed, it was also a lifeline, a sacred meeting place where her trust in God would take tangible form. Kneeling by the water's edge, she placed the basket gently among the reeds. It floated seamlessly, its sturdy frame cradling Moses with care. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Jochebed pressed her trembling fingers to her lips, her eyes welling with tears. "Lord, guide him," she whispered, her voice breaking. Miriam stood silently, her wide eyes fixed on the floating basket as it bobbed gently in the reeds. "I'll watch over him, Mother," she said, her voice steady with a courage beyond her years. The basket swayed with the rhythm of the Nile, surrounded by the tall papyrus stalks that danced softly in the breeze. The waters whispered ancient songs of creation, a gentle hymn that seemed to wrap the child in divine peace. Inside the basket, Moses stirred, his tiny hands reaching toward the light that filtered through the woven lid. Jochebed lingered for a moment longer, her heart torn between grief and hope. She placed a kiss on Miriam's forehead and turned to leave, her steps heavy yet resolute. The image of the basket nestled among the reeds stayed with her, a fragile yet powerful emblem of her trust in God. Miriam crouched low, her small frame hidden by the reeds. Her watchful eyes followed the basket, her heart beating in tune with the gentle rhythm of the water. Though her mother had left, Miriam felt an inexplicable calm, as if the very presence of God surrounded her. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, the Nile's gentle current carried the basket slightly out of the reeds. Its movement was almost imperceptible, a soft nudge guided by unseen hands. Nearby, laughter echoed through the still air. A group of maidens, adorned in fine linens, approached the water's edge, their sandals brushing softly against the earth. They dropped their basket in the water and began to swim. In the warmth of the sun, the water frothed to match the gentle's face. Among them was Pharaoh's daughter, her elegant movements filled with grace and curiosity. She paused by the river, drawn by a sound that seemed out of place, a soft whimper, faint yet distinct. Her eyes scanned the water until they fell upon the curious sight of the basket. "Fetch it for me," she said to one of her attendants, her voice filled with both command and wonder. The maiden waded into the water, her movements careful yet swift, and returned with the mysterious bundle. Pharaoh's daughter leaned over, her breath catching, as she pulled back the covering to reveal the baby within. Forus forth, rays of morning light. Moses' cry softened as he looked up, his innocent eyes meeting hers. A warmth spread through her heart, and she felt an unexplainable connection to the child. "This must be one of the Hebrew children," she murmured, her voice tinged with both realization and compassion. Hidden among the reeds, Miriam's heart raced as she watched the scene unfold. Her small hands clutched the stalks tightly, her breath held in anticipation. Would Pharaoh's daughter show kindness, or would this be the end of her baby brother's fragile journey? When the princess's expression softened, Miriam's courage swelled. She stepped out from her hiding place, her small figure illuminated by the morning light. "Shall I go and call a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" she asked, her voice steady and filled with conviction. Pharaoh's daughter turned, startled, but intrigued by the young girl's presence. She nodded thoughtfully, a faint smile gracing her lips. "Go," she said, her tone gentle yet commanding. Miriam wasted no time. Her bare feet moved swiftly across the dusty ground as she ran to find her mother. Her heart swelled with both urgency and hope, knowing that God's providence was at work. Jochebed's hands trembled as she followed Miriam back to the river. Her mind raced with thoughts, but her heart clung to the quiet assurance that God had not forgotten them. When she saw Pharaoh's daughter cradling Moses, her breath caught in her throat. "This is the child's mother," Miriam said boldly, her small frame standing tall with pride. I felt my heart. Pharaoh's daughter looked at Jochebed with a discerning gaze, then spoke with kindness. "Take this child and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages," she said, placing the baby into Jochebed's arms. Tears streamed down Jochebed's face as she held Moses close once more. It was more than she had dared to hope for. God had not only preserved her son, but had returned him to her care, under the protection of the palace. That night, in the quiet of their home, Jochebed held Moses close, her heart full of gratitude. She hummed a soft melody, a song of praise to the God who had seen her tears and answered her prayers. Manifestation 2.2. Miriam sat beside her, her eyes shining with joy. "God has a plan for Moses, doesn't he, Mother?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. "Yes, my child," Jochebed replied, stroking Moses's tiny head. "He has great plans, plans we cannot yet imagine. But tonight, we rest in his faithfulness." The small family sat together, their home filled with a peace that transcended their circumstances. Outside, the Nile continued its gentle song, a reminder of the God who orchestrates all things for good. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, the Nile's gentle current carried the basket slightly out of the reeds. Its movement was almost imperceptible, a soft nudge guided by unseen hands. Nearby, laughter echoed through the still air. A group of maidens, adorned in fine linens, approached the water's edge, their sandals brushing softly against the earth. Among them was Pharaoh's daughter, her elegant movements filled with grace and curiosity. She paused by the river, drawn by a sound that seemed out of place. A soft whimper, faint yet distinct. Her eyes scanned the water until they fell upon the curious sight of the basket. "Fetch it for me," she said to one of her attendants, her voice filled with both command and wonder. The maiden waded into the water, her movements careful yet swift, and returned with the mysterious bundle. Pharaoh's daughter leaned over, her breath catching as she pulled back the covering to reveal the baby within. Moses's cry softened as he looked up, his innocent eyes meeting hers. A warmth spread through her heart, and she felt an unexplainable connection to the child. "This must be one of the Hebrew children," she murmured, her voice tinged with both realization and compassion. Hidden among the reeds, Miriam's heart raced as she watched the scene unfold. Her small hands clutched the stalks tightly, her breath held in anticipation. Would Pharaoh's daughter show kindness, or would this be the end of her baby brother's fragile journey? When the princess's expression softened, Miriam's courage swelled. She stepped out from her hiding place, her small figure illuminated by the morning light. "Shall I go and call a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" she asked, her voice steady and filled with conviction. She said nothing, but her face remained frozen as she waited for the mirror to nurse the child. Pharaoh's daughter turned, startled but intrigued by the young girl's presence. She nodded thoughtfully, a faint smile gracing her lips. "Go," she said, her tone gentle yet commanding. Miriam wasted no time. Her bare feet moved swiftly across the dusty ground as she ran to find her mother. Her heart swelled with both urgency and hope, knowing that God's providence was at work. Jochebed's hands trembled as she followed Miriam back to the river. Her mind raced with thoughts, but her heart clung to the quiet assurance that God had not forgotten them. When she saw Pharaoh's daughter cradling Moses, her breath caught in her throat. As much as she wished to leave, her eyes stayed until the last flicker of light faded. "This is the child's mother," Miriam said boldly, her small frame standing tall with pride. Pharaoh's daughter looked at Jochebed with a discerning gaze, then spoke with kindness. "Take this child and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages," she said, placing the baby into Jochebed's arms. "Thank you, Jochebed." Tears streamed down Jochebed's face as she held Moses close once more. It was more than she had dared to hope for. God had not only preserved her son, but had returned him to her care, under the protection of the palace. That night, in the quiet of their home, Jochebed held Moses close, her heart full of gratitude. She hummed a soft melody, a song of praise to the God who had seen her tears and answered her prayers. Miriam sat beside her, her eyes shining with joy. "God has a plan for Moses, doesn't he, Mother?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. "Yes, my child," Jochebed replied, stroking Moses's tiny head. "He has great plans, plans we cannot yet imagine. But tonight, we rest in his faithfulness." The small family sat together, their home filled with a peace that transcended their circumstances. Outside, the Nile continued its gentle song, a reminder of the God who orchestrates all things for good. As the days turned into weeks, Jochebed nursed Moses with a heart brimming with gratitude and a quiet resolve. Every moment felt like a gift, but she knew this season of intimacy with her son was temporary. The time would come when she must release him to Pharaoh's household, trusting God to guide his path. In the evenings, she whispered prayers over Moses, her voice soft and full of hope. "Lord, you have given me the privilege of holding this child for a time. Prepare him for the life you have planned. Protect him, lead him, and let him grow into a man who serves your purpose." The shadows of uncertainty loomed, but Jochebed's faith remained steadfast. She drew strength from the knowledge that God's providence had already been so evident, guiding Moses' journey from the reeds to her arms once again. Miriam became Moses' constant protector, her youthful energy devoted to ensuring his safety. Whenever she sensed danger, she was quick to intervene, her small but watchful eyes always alert. Her bond with Moses deepened as she played with him, sang to him, and shared in her mother's prayers. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Miriam sat beside Jochebed, her voice filled with both concern and curiosity. "Mother, do you think Moses will remember us when he goes to live in Pharaoh's house?" Jochebed placed a comforting hand on Miriam's shoulder. "He may not remember everything, but the Lord will never leave him. God's hand is on his life, my child, just as it is on yours. We must trust him with all our hearts." The day came when Jochebed could no longer keep Moses hidden. With a heavy heart but unwavering faith, she prepared to deliver him to Pharaoh's daughter. She dressed Moses in simple, clean garments and wrapped him in a soft cloth, her tears falling as she kissed his forehead. Miriam stood beside her mother, her young heart struggling to understand the depth of the sacrifice. "Will he be safe, Mother?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We'll be safe in God's hands," Jochebed replied, her voice firm, despite the ache in her chest. "The same God who guided him on the river will guide him in Pharaoh's house." Together, they made their way to the palace gates, where Pharaoh's daughter awaited them. Jochebed placed Moses into the arms of the princess, her heart silently crying out to God for strength. Moses adjusted quickly to life in the palace, his curious nature endearing him to all who met him. Pharaoh's daughter treated him as her own, lavishing him with love and protection. Yet, within the grandeur of the palace walls, Moses carried a quiet resilience that hinted at his humble beginnings. At night, as he lay in his luxurious bed, the soft melodies of his mother's songs seemed to echo in his heart. Though he was too young to remember the specifics, the sense of love and faithfulness remained with him, a constant source of comfort and strength. As Moses grew, the seeds of purpose began to take root within him. He marveled at the stories of the gods of Egypt, yet felt a quiet stirring that drew him toward something greater. The lessons he had learned in his earliest days, though faint in memory, shaped his character and perspective. Pharaoh's daughter noticed his thoughtful demeanor and often encouraged him to share his ideas. "You have a unique mind, my son," she would say, brushing his hair with affection. "The gods must have destined you for something extraordinary."
But deep within, Moses felt that his destiny was guided by a power far beyond the deities of Egypt.
One evening, as Moses stood on the balcony overlooking the Nile, he felt a quiet connection to the river that had carried him to safety. The moonlight danced on the water's surface, and he wondered about the God his birth family had prayed to, a God who had seen and saved him. "Who are you?" he whispered into the night, "and why have you placed me here?" Though no audible answer came, a profound peace settled over his heart. He sensed that his life had a purpose beyond his understanding, one that would be revealed in time. Miriam often thought of Moses, her heart aching with both pride and longing. She prayed for him daily, trusting that God was watching over him. Though they lived separate lives, the bond they shared remained unbroken. One night, as she gazed at the stars, she whispered, "Lord, guide my brother. Let him grow into the man you have called him to be. protect him, and remind him of the love we have for him. Her prayers carried through the still night, a testament to her enduring faith and hope. Though he was surrounded by the luxuries of palace life, Moses' heart remained humble. He often observed the labor of the Hebrew people, their faces etched with weariness and pain. Something about their plight stirred his soul, though he could not yet comprehend why. The God who had watched over Moses as a baby was still at work, preparing him for the monumental task that lay ahead. Every step of his journey was a piece of the divine puzzle, a reflection of God's perfect plan unfolding. Moses continued to grow into a man of wisdom and strength, his days filled with royal education and training. Yet, despite his privileged life, a quiet stirring in his heart drew him toward the plight of the Hebrew people. As he walked through the palace gardens one evening, the sounds of labor from the fields beyond reached his ears. Faint, but persistent, he paused, closing his eyes and allowing the weight of those sounds to settle on his heart. Moses' interactions with the Hebrews were rare, but impactful. On one occasion, he observed a laborer struggling under the weight of a heavy load. Without hesitation, Moses approached and offered assistance, much to the astonishment of those around him. Why would a prince of Egypt lower himself for a slave? A palace official later questioned. Moses' reply was simple yet profound. Is it not the duty of the strong to help the weak? Compassion is not a burden, it is a privilege. The final verses of the prayer, read first and listen close, before descending into sleep. Though his words were spoken casually, they revealed the growing awareness in his heart, a divine compassion stirring within him. One night, Moses was visited by a vivid dream. He stood once again beside the Nile River, the reeds swaying gently in the breeze. In the dream, he saw his mother's face, her lips moving in silent prayer. He reached out to her, but the vision dissolved, replaced by the sight of the Hebrew people laboring under the harsh sun. When he awoke, his heart was heavy with questions. Who am I, truly? What is my purpose? He murmured into the stillness of his chamber. The answers seemed elusive, yet Moses felt a quiet assurance that his life was unfolding according to a greater plan. The pivotal moment came during a routine visit to the construction sites where the Hebrews toiled. Moses witnessed an Egyptian taskmaster striking a Hebrew slave with cruel blows. Something within him snapped, a righteous anger ignited by the injustice. Before he could fully process his actions, Moses intervened, striking the taskmaster and ending his life. The realization of what he had done filled him with a mixture of fear and conviction. He fled the scene, his heart pounding with the weight of his actions. Moses' return to the palace was marked by an inner turmoil he could not escape. Though his intervention had been driven by compassion, the consequences of his actions loomed large. He spent the night in restless prayer, seeking guidance and forgiveness.
Lord, have I failed you? He whispered, his voice trembling. Show me the path I must take.
The night passed in silence, but Moses felt a quiet assurance that God's hand was still upon him. guiding him even in his moments of weakness. When news of the taskmaster's death reached Pharaoh, Moses knew his life in Egypt was over. The palace that had once been his sanctuary was now a place of danger. Under the cover of night, he fled into the wilderness, his heart heavy with the loss of the life he had known. The journey was arduous, but Moses pressed on, driven by an unshakable sense that God was leading him to a new chapter. The vast desert stretched before him, both daunting and filled with promise. After days of wandering, Moses arrived in the land of Midian, where he encountered the daughters of Reuel, a priest of the region. When he saw them struggling to water their flock, he stepped in to assist, his heart compelled by the same compassion that had driven him before. Reuel welcomed Moses into his home, offering him a place of refuge. As Moses settled into his new life, he began to see the wilderness not as a place of exile, but as a place of preparation. The quiet nights in Midian offered Moses ample time for reflection. He tended to Reuel's flocks by day and gazed at the star-filled sky by night, his thoughts often turning to the God of his ancestors. He asked, "Lord, are you still with me?" He prayed one evening, the silence of the desert amplifying his words. Though no voice answered, Moses felt a deep peace, a reminder that God's presence transcended circumstances. Years passed, and Moses embraced his role as a shepherd. He found joy in the simplicity of his work, caring for the sheep with the same tenderness that God had shown him. The wilderness became his sanctuary, a place where he grew in humility and faith. One day, as he led the flock to a new pasture, Moses marveled at the beauty of the land. The quiet rhythm of his days had become a balm for his soul, a reminder of God's sustaining grace. Though Moses' life in Midian seemed unremarkable, God was quietly preparing him for something extraordinary. The skills he honed as a shepherd, patience, leadership, and perseverance, were shaping him into the man God had called him to be. The journey that had begun with a basket on the Nile was far from over. Moses' story was still unfolding, a testament to God's faithfulness and the power of his plans. One ordinary day in the wilderness, Moses led the sheep to the far side of the desert, near Mount Horeb. The air was crisp, and the sunlight bathed the rugged terrain in a golden hue. As Moses approached a thicket, his attention was drawn to a peculiar sight: a bush engulfed in flames, but not consumed. Curious, he stepped closer, only to hear a voice calling his name. "Moses, Moses." "Here I am," he responded, his voice trembling with awe. "Do not come any closer," the voice said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." The Lord revealed himself to Moses, declaring that he had heard the cries of his people in Egypt and had chosen Moses to deliver them. In that sacred moment, Moses' life was forever changed. The years of preparation in Midian had culminated in this divine calling. Though the encounter with God filled Moses with awe, it also stirred doubts within him. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. God's response was firm yet comforting. "I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." Even so, Moses hesitated. "What if they do not believe me or listen to me?" God, in his patience, gave Moses signs to perform, equipping him for the mission ahead. The staff in Moses' hand became a serpent and then returned to wood. His hand, when placed inside his cloak, turned leprous and was healed again. With each sign, God reminded Moses that his power would sustain him. When Moses returned to Reuel's house to share the news of his calling, he was met with mixed emotions. Reuel blessed Moses, acknowledging the weight of his mission, while Zipporah, Moses' wife, expressed concern for his safety. "God has called you for this purpose," she said softly, her eyes searching his. "We will support you, but the journey will not be easy." Moses held her hand tightly, his heart filled with gratitude for the family that had become his anchor. Together, they prepared for the journey to Egypt, trusting that God would guide their steps. The journey took less than an hour, and their feet were good, with partially missing too. As Moses set out for Egypt, his heart was a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. He carried the staff of God in his hand, a symbol of divine authority and reassurance. Along the way, he reflected on the path that had brought him to this moment. The basket on the Nile, the palace, the wilderness, and now the calling to deliver God's people. Each step brought him closer to his destiny, and as the familiar sights of Egypt came into view, Moses' resolve grew stronger. He knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but he also knew that he was not walking it alone. The quiet of the evening enveloped Moses as he camped near the outskirts of Egypt. The stars above seemed to echo the promise God had made to Abraham, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Moses knelt in prayer, his voice steady despite the weight of the task before him. "Lord, I trust in your plans. Use me as your servant to bring freedom to your people. Be strong and awake to your greatness. Wisdom is our guide." As he lay down to rest, a profound peace settled over him, a reminder of God's unwavering presence. The journey of Moses was far from over, but the assurance of God's faithfulness carried him forward, one step at a time. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. Exodus 3:02. The desert stretched endlessly, its dunes rolling like a sea of sand under the soft glow of a full moon. The air was still, heavy with the lingering warmth of the day, yet it carried a coolness that whispered through the sparse shrubs and rocks. Moses walked slowly, his sandals pressing lightly into the fine grains. The only sound, the faint crunch of sand beneath his feet. Above him, the stars glittered, their brilliance undimmed by any earthly light, as if they were drawing close to witness a moment that would change the course of history. Moses had wandered these lands for years, tending the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro. The wilderness had become his sanctuary, a place of reflection and peace far removed from the grandeur of Egypt, where he had once lived as a prince. His thoughts often wandered back to the events that had brought him here, the weight of his choices, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. But tonight, there was something different in the air, a quiet anticipation that Moses couldn't quite place. The stars seemed to shimmer with purpose, their light casting a gentle glow on the rocky path ahead. As he led his sheep towards the slopes of Mount Horeb, a sense of calm enveloped him. The mountain, ancient and silent, loomed in the distance, its rugged peaks bathed in the silvery light of the moon. Moses felt a deep reverence for this place, though he did not yet know why. It was as though the very ground beneath his feet carried the echoes of something sacred, something eternal. He paused for a moment, his staff in hand, and closed his eyes, letting the stillness of the night seep into his soul. The sheep grazed quietly nearby, their soft bleats blending with the occasional rustle of dry grass. Moses glanced at them, a faint smile touching his lips. He had come to love these animals, their simple lives a stark contrast to the complexities he had left behind. They trusted him, followed him, and depended on him, and in their quiet company he had found solace. The rhythmic beat of his heartbeat. Yet, even as he stood there, a shepherd among his flock, a flicker of restlessness stirred within him, a longing for something more. As Moses stood, lost in thought, a sudden movement caught his eye. He turned, his gaze drawn to a flicker of light in the distance. At first he thought it was a trick of his eyes, the reflection of the moonlight off a distant rock. But as he focused, the light seemed to grow brighter, more vibrant. It wasn't the soft glow of a star or the gleam of the moon's reflection. It was a fire. Moses squinted, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't the blazing inferno one might expect in such a dry place, nor was it like the dancing flames of a campfire. This fire was still, contained, yet shining with an otherworldly brilliance. And what was most strange, despite the fire's intensity, the bush it enveloped didn't seem to burn. The branches remained green, the leaves unscorched. The fire was not consuming it. Curiosity urged Moses forward. His steps were slow but deliberate, the soft crunch of sand beneath his feet the only sound in the quiet desert. His heart began to quicken, for he had never seen anything like this before. The light beckoned him, not with violence, but with a gentle pull, as though inviting him into its mystery. As he drew nearer, the heat of the fire did not scorch his skin. But there was something else, a presence, a weight in the air that filled him with awe and wonder. The fire shimmered and crackled, yet the silence remained unbroken. Moses felt a stirring within his chest, a recognition that something sacred was unfolding before him. Moses hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. Was this a vision? A dream? Yet, as he stood there, transfixed by the sight of the unconsumed bush, a voice broke the silence, as clear and powerful as the desert winds. "Moses, Moses," the voice called, each syllable rich with authority and tenderness. Moses froze, his breath catching in his throat. Who could it be? He glanced around, his mind racing, but there was no one there. Only the quiet fire and the stillness of the night. The voice had come from within the flames, yet it felt as though it echoed from every direction. "Here I am," Moses responded instinctively, his voice trembling as the weight of the moment settled upon him. He had heard many voices in his life, but none had sounded like this, so filled with power and mystery. "Do not come near," the voice instructed, its tone now firm and filled with reverence. "Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." Moses knelt, slowly removing his sandals, his heart pounding in his chest. The fire before him burned with an intensity that did not consume, but somehow he knew the ground beneath him was not like any other. It was holy, sacred, set apart for this moment, for this encounter. As Moses stood barefoot on the sacred ground, the voice continued, each word seeming to echo in his heart. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Moses' heart pounded in his chest as he bowed his head, overwhelmed by the weight of the words. The God of his ancestors, the God who had spoken to them, was now speaking to him. The connection to his past, to the promises made to his forefathers, was alive in this moment, and Moses could feel the weight of it, like a heavy mantle settling over him. God continued, revealing more of his plan. "I have seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey." Moses' mind raced as the implications of these words sank in. The God of his ancestors was speaking of a rescue, a deliverance. His people, his own kin, were suffering in Egypt, and now God was coming to their aid. But why was he speaking to Moses? Why now? "Who am I?" Moses whispered, more to himself than to the voice. "That I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" Moses smiled. He had been a fugitive for so long. His past in Egypt, his life as an Egyptian prince, his crime, his exile, felt like a distant, irreparable mistake. Moses had left Egypt behind, never imagining he would return. Yet now, God was calling him to do the impossible, to confront Pharaoh, to lead a nation out of slavery. "Who am I?" he repeated, his voice breaking with doubt. The fire before him seemed to burn more brightly, as if in response. God's answer was simple, yet filled with assurance. "I will be with you." And this phrase guided my friend. The promise of God's presence was overwhelming. It wasn't Moses' strength or wisdom that would matter. It was God's power, his guidance. Moses was not alone in this task. God himself would accompany him every step of the way. A minute later, a Shema showed him the second living room. The walls were wooded. Moses' heart was still heavy with doubt, but God continued to speak, reassuring him further. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. This, Moses thought, would be the sign. The evidence that he had indeed been sent by God would come after the deliverance, when the people of Israel would worship God on this very mountain. In the quiet, peaceful wilderness, surrounded by the desert's stillness, Moses began to grasp the enormity of the task ahead. Yet the weight of his calling was not crushing. It was balanced by the steady assurance of God's presence. Still unsure of how to convince the people that God had truly sent him, Moses asked, "If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" God paused, and Moses could almost feel the reverence in the air, like a hush falling over the world. Then the answer came, and Moses would never forget the weight of those words. "Say this to the people of Israel: 'I Am has sent me to you.'" I Am, the eternal, self-existent one, the name that would resonate through all of history, a name beyond all human understanding, yet intimate and personal. It was the name of the Creator, the name of the God who had always been and who would always be. Moses understood that this name would be a foundation for his mission, a promise that the God who called him was eternal and trustworthy. Moses stood in the presence of the burning bush, his heart still uncertain. Even with the revelation of God's name, the mission ahead of him seemed daunting. How could he, a man who had fled Egypt years ago, possibly stand before Pharaoh? How could he convince a nation of slaves that he had been sent by the God of their ancestors? But as the fire burned brighter, so did the clarity of God's purpose. Moses would not be asked to do this alone. God would go before him, preparing the way. The people would listen, not because of Moses' ability, but because of God's power working through him. God's voice, full of authority and comfort, spoke again. "I will give you signs, Moses. You will know that I am with you. You will perform signs to show the people that I have sent you." Moses took a deep breath. The Lord's words were beginning to take root in his heart. The path before him was clear. He was to go, and God would be with him every step of the way. The fear and reluctance that had held him back slowly began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence in the Lord's promises. As Moses stood before the burning bush, now illuminated by the light of God's presence, he felt a deep peace settle within him. The weight of his doubts and fears began to lift. He was not the man he had been in Egypt. He was not the prince or the fugitive. He was a servant of the I Am, chosen to fulfill God's purpose. With this understanding, Moses turned back toward the world that awaited him, an Egypt that would soon know the power of the I Am. The journey ahead would not be easy, but Moses now understood that the God who had spoken to him in the burning bush would lead him, guide him, and empower him. Despite the promises and assurances from God, Moses could feel his doubts rising again. He had seen God work powerfully before, through the miracles in Egypt and in the lives of his ancestors. But this task was different. It wasn't just about witnessing the work of God. It was about being the one called to bring it about. "I am not eloquent," Moses protested. "Neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue." Moses felt inadequate for the mission God had given him. He had spent years living in the wilderness, away from the hustle and politics of Egypt. His speech, his thoughts, everything seemed to have grown rusty. Could he really confront Pharaoh? Could he speak to the Israelites, who would surely question him, with any measure of confidence? God responded, patient but firm. "Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf, or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, and I will be with your mouth, and teach you what you shall speak." Moses, now feeling the weight of this calling, realized that it was not his own abilities that mattered. It was God's power working through him, and that was enough. They followed Moses down 100 flights of stairs to the small room they had shared for years. Moses, still struggling with his hesitation, looked back at the bush. The voice that had comforted him now turned with a slight shift, both in tone and authority. But he said, "Oh, my Lord, please, send someone else." Moses was tired. He had already run from Egypt once, and the thought of returning to that place, of confronting Pharaoh and leading an entire nation, filled him with fear and uncertainty. He didn't feel up to the task, but the Lord's response was not harsh. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, God said. But he still provided a solution. "Is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart." God's grace extended to Moses in his weakness. God would provide Aaron as a companion, someone to help him speak and support him in the journey ahead. Moses was not alone in this task. With Aaron at his side, Moses set off on the journey back to Egypt. The fear still lingered in Moses' heart, but the promise of God's presence, as well as the help of his brother, gave him strength. The more he thought about the people of Israel, oppressed, hurting, and crying out to God, the more the mission began to take shape in his heart. This was not about him. It was about the deliverance of God's people. They traveled, following God's direction, and Moses began to prepare himself for the task ahead. Every step was one of obedience, as he trusted in the Lord's plan. When Moses and Aaron arrived in Egypt, they gathered the elders of Israel. There was fear in their hearts too, for they had been enslaved for generations, and many had lost hope that God would ever deliver them. But as Moses and Aaron shared the words of the Lord, how God had heard their cries and was sending them deliverance, something began to stir in the hearts of the Israelites. God's promises were not forgotten. The same God who had delivered their ancestors, was still at work. As Moses spoke of God's faithfulness, the people listened. Slowly, they began to believe. There was a flicker of hope, the first light of what would come. Moses and Aaron were chosen, and God was with them. With the elders gathered and the people's hopes rising, the next step was to go before Pharaoh. Moses stood at the gates of Pharaoh's palace, his heart pounding in his chest. Aaron spoke first, delivering God's command. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh's response was swift and dismissive. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." The defiance of Pharaoh echoed in Moses' ears, and fear once again began to rise in his heart. He had expected resistance, but this was more than he had anticipated. But God had already spoken. This was not Moses' fight alone. It was God's. God had already prepared a way, and the outcome had been decided long before Moses stood before Pharaoh. As Pharaoh hardened his heart and refused to let the people go, the consequences were soon felt. God had warned Moses that Pharaoh would not listen, but that he would show his mighty works in the land of Egypt. Plagues began to fall upon Egypt. Water turned to blood. Frogs swarmed the land. Locusts devoured the crops. Yet Pharaoh remained obstinate, refusing to acknowledge the power of the God of Israel. Moses watched with growing resolve. Every sign, every wonder was not for the glory of Moses or his words, but for the glory of God, that Egypt and Israel alike might know the Lord. Even in the midst of the unfolding disaster, Moses knew that God's timing was perfect, and his purposes would be fulfilled. As Moses witnessed the plagues ravage Egypt, he began to understand that deliverance would come through great struggle. But it was a struggle that had already been won in the heavens. Each plague was a declaration of God's sovereignty over Egypt and the gods of Egypt. With each new plague, Pharaoh's resistance weakened, but so did his resolve. Finally, the day came when Pharaoh's heart was broken. He agreed to let the Israelites go, but only after the final, most devastating plague had struck Egypt, the death of the firstborn. Moses, filled with sorrow for the nation, also recognized the justice and mercy of God at work. The deliverance was near. Before the final plague struck, God gave Moses specific instructions for the people. They were to take a lamb without blemish and sacrifice it, marking their doors with its blood. This sign would protect them from the angel of death. As Moses relayed the instructions to the people, there was a deep sense of reverence. The lamb's blood was a symbol of God's mercy, a mark of safety for those who trusted in his provision. That night, as the angel of death passed through the land, the Israelites were spared. The night was long but peaceful for those who had obeyed. The morning after the plague passed, Pharaoh finally relented. With a heavy heart, he told Moses and the Israelites to leave. And so they did, in haste, taking only what they could carry and following Moses toward freedom. As they walked out of Egypt, the sun began to rise, casting golden light across the land. The long journey ahead seemed uncertain, but Moses knew that God was with them. The people, once oppressed and broken, were now free. As Moses and the people of Israel crossed the desert, their hearts filled with joy and fear in equal measure. The uncertainty of the journey ahead loomed large, but they were no longer slaves in Egypt. God had kept his promise to deliver them, and Moses, though weary, felt the weight of God's presence more strongly than ever. "Do not be afraid," Moses told the people. "The Lord your God is with you." God's call was not just a momentary directive. It was an ongoing, living presence that would lead them through the wilderness. Though the path ahead was unknown, Moses knew that with God guiding them, they would never be forsaken. Oh, as Moses and the Israelites journeyed into the wilderness, they found themselves trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army. The sound of horses' hooves grew louder behind them, and panic began to spread among the people. The water stretched out before them, deep and wide. "Why did you bring us here to die?" the people cried out to Moses. "Didn't we tell you to leave us in Egypt?" Moses, though shaken by their cries, remained firm. He turned to God, who spoke to him with gentle assurance. "Tell the people to go forward. Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea." Moses did as instructed, and in that moment, a powerful wind swept through the waters, parting the Red Sea and creating a path on dry land. The Israelites walked through the sea, the waters towering on either side like walls. Pharaoh's army, desperate to follow, was swept away when the waters returned to their natural course. The Israelites marveled at what God had done for them, and Moses sang a song of praise, lifting up God's name for his deliverance. The people were finally free, and the Lord had shown his mighty power. After crossing the Red Sea, the people journeyed further into the wilderness. But their joy soon turned to bitterness when they found water at Marah, only to discover it was undrinkable. The people, frustrated and thirsty, began to complain again. "What shall we drink?" they cried. Moses, seeking God's guidance, went before the Lord. God showed him a piece of wood and told him to throw it into the waters. When Moses obeyed, the waters became sweet, and the people were able to drink. God had provided once again, and the people began to learn to trust in him, even in the most difficult circumstances. As they journeyed further, the people's supplies began to dwindle. They complained again, longing for the food they had left behind in Egypt. The Shmashel, "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full." But the Lord responded with grace. He told Moses that he would send bread from heaven to satisfy their hunger. In the morning, the ground was covered with a fine, flaky substance, which the people called manna. God provided this heavenly food for them every day, except the Sabbath, when they were to rest and remember his provision. The people learned that their needs would always be met by God, as long as they trusted and followed his instructions. As the Israelites continued their journey, they camped at a place called Rephidim, where there was no water. Once again, the people began to grumble and complain. "When did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" Moses, distressed by their complaints, turned to God for guidance. God told him to strike a rock at Horeb with his staff, and when he did, water poured forth, providing drink for the people. This miracle reminded the Israelites that God was with them, even when the circumstances seemed impossible. Moses called the place Massah and Meribah, meaning testing and quarreling, because the people had tested God's patience and quarreled with him. Soon after the water from the rock, the Israelites faced their first military battle as they were attacked by the Amalekites. Moses commanded Joshua to lead the army while he stood on the mountain, holding the staff of God in his hands. As long as Moses held his hands up, the Israelites prevailed. But whenever his hands grew tired and fell, the Amalekites began to win. Aaron and Hur, seeing Moses' struggle, held up his hands, one on each side, ensuring that they remained steady until the battle was won. The Israelites were victorious, and Moses built an altar to the Lord, calling it, "The Lord is my banner." This victory marked the beginning of God's defense of his people, and they learned to trust him in times of battle. As Moses led the people, he became burdened with the responsibility of judging disputes and leading the people in all matters. His father-in-law, Jethro, heard of the struggles Moses was facing and came to visit. Jethro, a wise man, observed Moses' efforts and suggested that he delegate some of his responsibilities. "You will wear yourself out, both you and these people," Jethro warned. "Select able men from all the people, men who fear God, who are trustworthy and hate a bribe, and place them over the people as leaders of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens." Moses listened to Jethro's counsel, and as a result he was able to share the leadership burden with others, enabling him to continue leading the people effectively without becoming overwhelmed. The Israelites arrived at Mount Sinai, where God called Moses to the top of the mountain. There God spoke to Moses, giving him instructions for the people and revealing his plans to make a covenant with them. "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians," God said, "and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples." Moses returned to the people with God's words, and the people responded, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." And so, God established his covenant with Israel, promising to be their God and to guide them on the path of righteousness. On Mount Sinai, Moses received the law from God, commands and ordinances to govern the people of Israel. The law would guide them in holiness, worship, and community living. Moses stayed on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, receiving the tablets of stone with God's commands written on them. The people below, however, grew impatient, and some began to question if Moses would ever return. But Moses remained in God's presence, preparing to lead the people in the ways of righteousness. While Moses was on the mountain, the people grew restless and fearful. They asked Aaron to make them a god to go before them, for they had no idea when Moses would return. Aaron, reluctantly, created a golden calf, and the people worshipped it, saying, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Moses descended the mountain and saw the people's idolatry, his heart broke. He threw down the tablets in anger, breaking them, and confronted Aaron. The people repented, and Moses interceded for them before God, pleading for his mercy. God, in his grace, forgave the people, but he also warned them of the consequences of turning away from him. The people learned the seriousness of sin and the importance of remaining faithful to God. Despite the people's failure, God continued to be faithful to his covenant. He instructed Moses to carve out new tablets of stone and to come back up the mountain. There, God renewed his covenant with Moses and the people, declaring his mercy and justice. God revealed himself to Moses in a powerful moment, proclaiming, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness." Moses returned to the people with the new tablets and with a renewed sense of purpose. The people, though they had faltered, had been restored and the covenant had been reaffirmed. With God's presence once again among them, the Israelites prepared to journey forward. For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your houses to strike you. Exodus 12:23. The night air hung still, the moon casting a pale light over the homes of the Israelites in Egypt. Families had gathered in their humble dwellings, each heart heavy with anticipation. The great day of deliverance was drawing near, but for now there was only quiet. The streets were eerily calm, the usual hustle and bustle of the day replaced by a stillness that settled over the land like a blanket. Inside each home, preparations were underway, but there was no hurry. Everything had to be done carefully, precisely, and in reverence. The lambs had been slaughtered earlier in the day, their blood collected in bowls and ready to be spread over the doorposts. The bitter herbs, unleavened bread, and roasted lamb were prepared with reverence, each element of the meal steeped in meaning. And yet there was a deep sense of peace, a trust that had grown in the hearts of the Israelites as they awaited God's deliverance. The families gathered together, whispering prayers for protection. Though the air outside felt heavy with uncertainty, inside the homes of the faithful there was a stillness, a quiet confidence that God's promises would be fulfilled. Each person, young and old, prepared their hearts for what was to come, understanding that tonight was not just a night like any other. This was the night when God would pass through Egypt, sparing the homes marked by the blood of the Lamb, and bringing judgment to the land. It was the night of their salvation. The time had come to apply the blood of the Lamb to the doorposts. The family gathered at the entrance of their home, and the father, with reverent hands, dipped a sprig of hyssop into the blood. The air was filled with the earthy scent of the blood, mingling with the smell of the lamb roasting on the fire. He marked the top of the doorframe and then each side post, his heart quiet but full of trust in God's instructions. There was no fear, only a deep assurance that God was watching over them. The children watched in silence, sensing the importance of the moment, their small faces illuminated by the flickering flame of the torch the father held. Their eyes filled with a quiet wonder as they understood that this night was different from all others. They would not be sleeping through the night, but would stay awake, keeping watch, knowing that the moment for God's deliverance was at hand. Each person in the family prayed softly, thanking God for his provision and the promise that he would protect them. The house was filled with a sacred stillness, broken only by the rustling of the wind outside. No one spoke of the fear that lingered in the air, for fear had no place where God's presence was. Instead, there was a peace that surpassed understanding, a confidence that, no matter what happened outside their home, they were safe under the shelter of God's protection. As the night stretched on, the homes of Egypt remained eerily quiet. There was a deep, heavy silence that seemed to hang in the air, broken only by the occasional whisper of a prayer or the rustling of robes as families huddled together in their homes. The homes marked by the blood of the Lamb stood as a testament to faith, to God's promises kept. The Israelites were ready, waiting in the stillness, their hearts full of expectancy. At midnight, a sound echoed through the air, a cry of distress, a wail of sorrow. The destroyer had passed through Egypt, and the firstborn of the Egyptians were struck down. But not one home of the Israelites was touched. The blood of the Lamb had marked the way for God's protection. The families stayed inside, holding their breath, knowing that God had passed over them, and they were safe. Inside their homes, they continued to pray and give thanks, waiting for the moment when God would fully deliver them. The silence outside grew deeper, the storm of judgment passing over the land, leaving behind only the homes that had been marked with the blood of the Lamb. And inside, the people of God rested in the assurance that their faith had been rewarded. As the night wore on, a sense of peace settled over the homes of the Israelites. The wailing from the Egyptian households was distant now, growing fainter as the hours passed. And yet, the Israelites remained quiet, their hearts full of gratitude and awe. It was the peace that comes from knowing that God had protected them. It was the peace that comes from trusting His promises, even in the face of darkness. The Israelites had been saved not by their own strength or by their own efforts, but by God's grace. They had obeyed His instructions, and He had kept His promise. In the darkness of the night, they had been given the light of deliverance. The blood of the Lamb had protected them, and now they could rest in the peace that only God could provide. As the first light of dawn began to break, the families gathered once again, their hearts filled with joy and thanksgiving. The night had passed, and they had been spared. They had been protected, not because of their own worthiness, but because of God's great mercy. And as they looked to the future, they knew that this night, this Passover, would be remembered for generations to come as a symbol of God's faithfulness and protection. As the first light of dawn slowly crept across the land of Egypt, the Israelites remained in their homes, their hearts full of gratitude. The sound of distant mourning grew louder, but inside each dwelling, marked with the blood of the Lamb, there was an overwhelming sense of peace. The terror that had gripped Egypt the night before was now distant, and the Israelites, though still awake, felt a sense of calm settle upon them. The families had stayed close together throughout the night, comforting each other with quiet words of reassurance. Now, with the arrival of the morning sun, they began to feel the weight of God's deliverance sink in. The horror that had struck the Egyptians had passed over them. Their faith had been rewarded. It was as though the very air around them had changed, no longer filled with the dread of judgment, but with the peace of salvation. Mothers embraced their children, and fathers held their families close, knowing that God had done something miraculous. The promise He had given them was now real. The blood on their doorposts had been a shield of protection, keeping them safe in the midst of calamity. As the Israelites gathered together in the quiet of the early morning, the first call came from Moses. His voice rang out across the camp, full of purpose. This night will not be forgotten. It will be a sign for you, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. He reminded the people that this moment, the moment of their deliverance, was not merely an event to remember, but one to honor with an annual celebration. This would be the night when God's great act of mercy would be forever etched in their hearts and lives. The Israelites looked to Moses, their leader, with gratitude in their eyes. They understood now more than ever why this night was sacred. It was not only a moment of salvation for them as a people, but a symbol of God's protection, provision, and His enduring faithfulness. Moses' words encouraged the families to reflect on the significance of the night. The blood of the Lamb had spared them, but it was not just about the Lamb. It was about trusting in the power of God's word and promises. It was about faith in His will and His protection. This night would become the foundation of their worship, a time to remember and honor the God who had saved them from certain destruction. As Moses instructed, the people began to prepare for the days ahead. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, which would follow the Passover, was about to begin. The bread would be unleavened, without yeast, as a reminder of the haste with which the Israelites had to leave Egypt. The yeast, often symbolic of sin, was a reminder that they had to leave the old ways behind as they stepped into freedom. Families gathered together to bake their unleavened bread, just as the Lord had commanded. The simple bread without yeast or leavening was a humble reminder of God's provision. It was a practical act, but one filled with deep symbolism. They were not just baking bread, they were making a covenant with God, reaffirming their commitment to obey Him and walk in the freedom He had given them. As the bread was prepared, the people of Israel would eat it, not just as a meal, but as an act of remembrance, giving thanks for God's deliverance. Every bite, every morsel was a tribute to the miraculous salvation they had experienced. The day after the Passover night, the call to leave Egypt came. Moses gathered the people, and they packed their belongings, ready to follow God's direction into the wilderness. The homes they had known for generations were behind them, but they were no longer bound by slavery. As they journeyed out of Egypt, they could feel the weight of their chains lifted, their spirits buoyed by the deliverance that had come through God's mighty hand. The Israelites walked with a newfound confidence, their heads held high. The road ahead was uncertain, but they knew God had gone before them. He had promised to be with them, and they had seen his power with their own eyes. The sight of the Egyptian army's defeat, the protection of the blood of the Lamb, and the victory of the night before fueled their faith. As they began their journey, the whole community moved together. The children, no longer fearful, ran beside their parents, laughing and playing. The women comforted one another, and the men discussed what lay ahead, filled with the hope that only God's deliverance could bring. Now that the Israelites had left Egypt, the first celebration of the Passover took place. They gathered at the foot of Mount Sinai to honor the deliverance they had experienced. The entire community came together, offering sacrifices of thanksgiving, each family contributing to the communal meal. The atmosphere was filled with joy and reverence as they gathered around the fire, the smoke rising as an offering to God. The families, now free from the oppression of Egypt, shared the lamb and unleavened bread in fellowship. The bitter herbs were eaten with gratitude, reminding them of the hardship they had endured, but also of the sweetness of their new freedom. The sounds of prayers and songs filled the air as the people rejoiced in their salvation. In this first celebration, the people of Israel understood that the Passover was not just a feast, but a covenant, a perpetual act of worship that would be passed down through the generations. The meaning of the night had become clear. It was not just a remembrance of the past, but a living, breathing testimony to God's faithfulness and love. As the celebration continued, Moses reminded the people that their deliverance was not the end of their journey, but the beginning of a new chapter. God had rescued them from the bondage of Egypt, and now they would walk in the freedom of his promises. The blood of the Lamb had been a sign of protection, but it was also a sign of God's continued watchfulness over his people. Now God had rescued them from the bondage of Egypt and sent them back to the mountain. He reminded them of the future, that even when they faced challenges, God would provide for them. The sacrifice of the Lamb was not just a one-time event, but a continuing symbol of God's provision and care. Through every trial they would face, God would be their protector, their provider, and their deliverer. The families gathered around, listening intently. The future was uncertain, but the one thing they knew for sure was that God would never leave them. His promises were sure, and they would continue to trust in his power, love, and guidance. As the years went on, the Israelites continued to celebrate the Passover year after year, remembering the night when God passed over their homes and delivered them from Egypt. It became more than just a ritual. It became a cornerstone of their identity as God's chosen people. Every year, as they gathered to share in the meal, they told the story of the Passover to their children, reminding them of God's faithfulness. The meal became a time not only of remembrance, but also of teaching, as parents passed down the story of God's deliverance, ensuring that the next generation would never forget the night when God spared them The Passover was not just to look back at what God had done. It was also a declaration of trust in what he would continue to do. With each passing year, the people of Israel grew in their understanding of God's character. They had been delivered once, and they knew that he would continue to be their Savior, their protector, and their provider. As the years turned to decades, the Passover became a symbol of God's covenant with his people. It was not just a remembrance of an event, but a celebration of the ongoing relationship between God and his people. The Israelites knew that God had made an everlasting covenant with them, and the blood of the Lamb would always be a reminder of his promises. Each year, as they gathered around the table to celebrate the Passover, the Israelites looked forward to the fulfillment of God's promises. They knew that God's faithfulness would endure forever, and with each passing year, they were reminded that their salvation was secure. As the new generations of Israelites grew up, they continued to hold fast to the Passover tradition, understanding the significance of the night and the story it told. For the children, it was a time to learn of God's great mercy and love. For the adults, it was a time to reflect on the journey that had brought them from Egypt to the land promised to them. In the quiet of the evening, as the Passover meal was eaten, they understood that God was still working in their lives. His deliverance was not a one-time event, but an ongoing reality. The hope of a better future, of full deliverance, was always in their hearts, and they knew that the God who had protected them then would continue to be with them forever. As families settled into the solemnity of the Passover evening, the significance of redemption began to take root in their hearts. The lamb had been sacrificed, not for its own sake, but as a substitute for each firstborn within the households of Israel. The cost of their deliverance weighed heavy, reminding them of God's mercy and justice. It was this labor of stewardship that gave life, firm footing for them with God. Parents held their children close, whispering prayers of gratitude for their lives. Elders sat by the flickering firelight, their weathered faces filled with awe as they recounted God's promise to redeem his people. The symbolism of the lamb, the unleavened bread, and the bitter herbs began to weave itself into the fabric of their faith. In that quiet moment, they recognized that redemption was not just an event, but a gift of love from their Creator. They understood that their freedom from Egypt was only the beginning of a greater journey, a journey where God's covenant would shape their identity and purpose. The blood of the lamb on the doorposts was more than a ritual. It was a sign of obedience and trust. As the Israelites reflected on the events of the sacred night, they saw the blood not just as a physical mark, but as a testimony to their faith in God's word. Moses had told them that the blood would be a sign for the Lord to pass over their homes, sparing their firstborn children. But now, in the stillness of the night, they realized that the sign was also for them, a reminder that their safety rested entirely in God's hands. As soon as Moses stepped off the bridge, she raised his hands and placed them over his head. Fathers who had carefully painted their doorposts the night before stood in silent reverence, knowing that their act of obedience had shielded their families. Mothers whispered prayers of thanks, their hearts overwhelmed with the reality of God's faithfulness. Even the children, sensing the importance of the moment, listened quietly as their parents explained the meaning of the blood and the significance of trusting in God's promises. The night outside was eerily silent, yet inside the homes of the Israelites there was a quiet sense of assurance. The act of marking their homes with the blood of the Lamb had not just brought physical protection, but also a deep spiritual peace. Families sat together, recounting the story of their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, men who had trusted in God through uncertain times. They were reminded that the same God who had led their forefathers was now leading them. This trust in God's provision allowed them to find rest, even in the midst of judgment sweeping through Egypt. The stillness became a symbol of their faith. It was not the calm before the storm, but the peace that came from knowing that God was in control. Though the Israelites could not see him, they felt the presence of God watching over them. The blood-stained doorposts became a visible reminder of the invisible hand of their protector. As the angel of the Lord passed through Egypt, sparing the homes marked by the blood, the Israelites remained safe under his care. The weight of his protection was palpable, and they understood that it was his mercy that shielded them, not their own actions or worthiness. Jochebed, the mother of a young child, held her baby close, marveling at the lengths to which God had gone to preserve his people. She prayed silently, thanking him for his steadfast love. Nearby, her husband sat in quiet reflection, his heart full of gratitude for the God who delivered his people with such tenderness and strength. While the homes of the Israelites were filled with peace, a different story unfolded in the land of Egypt. Cries of anguish echoed through the streets as families discovered the loss of their firstborn children. The weight of judgment had fallen, and Pharaoh's hardened heart began to break under the reality of God's power. Inside their homes, the Israelites mourned for the suffering of their Egyptian neighbors. Though they had been enslaved and mistreated, they could not ignore the pain that rippled through the land. Their deliverance had come at a great cost, and they prayed that even in this judgment, God's mercy would prevail. The firstborn sons of the Israelites, spared by the blood of the Lamb, were living symbols of God's grace. Parents held their children tightly, knowing that the only reason they had been spared was God's unmerited favor. It was a humbling reminder that they were not saved by their own righteousness, but by God's divine plan. As the first rays of dawn pierced the horizon, a decree resounded through the streets of Egypt. Pharaoh, once defiant and unyielding, now stood defeated, his voice trembling as he ordered Moses and Aaron to take the Israelites and leave. Go, take your people, your flocks, your herds, everything, leave my land, and bless me also. The Israelites, hearing the urgency in Pharaoh's command, hurriedly prepared to depart. Bread dough, still unleavened, was bound in cloth and carried on shoulders. Treasured belongings were hastily gathered, while neighbors handed over gold, silver, and precious goods, urging the Israelites to leave quickly. The air was thick with both relief and apprehension. Families gathered together, recounting the events of the night with reverent gratitude. They had witnessed the mighty hand of God, and though their hearts ached for the sorrow that had fallen on Egypt, they knew this moment marked the beginning of their deliverance. The God of their ancestors had spoken, and they were finally free to go. The streets of Goshen filled with the sound of thousands of footsteps as the Israelites began their journey. Men, women, and children moved together in a great procession, their flocks and herds trailing behind. The sheer number of people was staggering. A multitude who had been bound in slavery, but now marched forward in freedom. The air was filled with songs of deliverance. Miriam, Moses' sister, led a group of women in a joyful chorus, their tambourines echoing in rhythm with the steps of the people. Though the path ahead was unknown, their faith in God's promises propelled them forward. The pillar of cloud, visible even in the daylight, stood as a divine guide, leading them toward the wilderness. Each step away from Egypt felt lighter than the last, the burdens of bondage left behind. Together, they journeyed toward the promise of a land flowing with milk and honey, their hearts swelling with hope. As the Israelites traveled, the unleavened bread they had prepared became their sustenance. Mothers portioned out the simple meal to their families, the taste of the bread reminding them of the haste with which they had left Egypt. The unleavened bread carried deeper meaning than mere sustenance. It became a symbol of obedience, a reminder of God's command to be ready to leave at a moment's notice. Each bite was taken with reverence, a tangible connection to the faith that had carried them through the Passover night. Around the campfires at night, stories of God's faithfulness were shared. Elders spoke of the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, grounding the younger generation in the legacy of God's promises. The bread, plain yet sacred, nourished not only their bodies, but also their spirits as they journeyed through the wilderness. As the Israelites moved farther from Egypt, the landscape began to change. The fertile plains gave way to rocky paths and open wilderness. The people felt both exhilaration and trepidation as they crossed into unfamiliar territory. Moses, walking at the front of the procession, lifted his eyes to the pillar of cloud that guided them. He knew that God's presence was leading them, yet the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his heart. The murmurs of the people behind him were filled with questions. Where would they find water? How would they sustain their flocks? Moses reassured them, his voice steady. The Lord who brought us out of Egypt will not abandon us. He will provide, just as he promised. The people drew strength from his confidence, their trust in God renewed with each step forward. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night became more than a guide for the Israelites. It was a tangible reminder of God's protective presence. As the sun set and darkness blanketed the wilderness, the fiery pillar illuminated the camp, casting a warm glow over the weary travelers. Children stared in awe at the flickering flames, their young minds filled with wonder at the sight. Parents held their little ones close, pointing to the pillar and whispering, "That is the presence of the Lord, watching over us." The nights were filled with peace, even in the unfamiliar wilderness. The Israelites rested in the knowledge that the God who had delivered them from Egypt was with them, guiding and protecting them on this journey to freedom. As the Israelites paused to rest along their journey, they began to reflect on the significance of their deliverance. Around the campfires, the elders recounted the events of the Passover night, ensuring that the memory of God's mighty acts would be passed down to future generations. Children listened with wide eyes as their parents described the lamb's blood on the doorposts and the angel of the Lord passing over their homes. The stories became a cornerstone of their identity as a people set apart by God, a legacy of faith that would endure for generations. Miriam led a song of remembrance, her voice strong and clear as she sang of God's power and mercy. The people joined in, their voices rising together in a chorus of praise. Though the path ahead was uncertain, they carried with them the unshakable assurance of God's faithfulness. As the Israelites journeyed onward, they began to understand that their deliverance was not just about freedom from Egypt. It was about becoming a covenant people. The God who had rescued them had a purpose for their lives, a purpose that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. Moses, standing before the gathered people, spoke words of encouragement. The Lord has brought us out of Egypt to be His own people, a holy nation. He will lead us to the land He promised to our ancestors, and there we will serve Him with all our hearts. The people responded with shouts of affirmation, their voices echoing through the wilderness. They were no longer slaves, but children of the Most High God, called to live in obedience and trust. The journey was far from over, but their faith in God's promises gave them the strength to continue. As the Israelites continued their journey, Moses called the people to pause and reflect on their newfound freedom. Around the campfires, families gathered to offer thanks to God for His deliverance. For the first time in their lives, they could freely worship the God of their ancestors without fear of oppression. Miriam, always a source of inspiration, began to dance with her tambourine, leading the women in a celebration of praise. "Sing to the Lord, for He has triumphed gloriously," she exclaimed. The men, women, and children joined in, their voices ringing out into the vast wilderness. Miriam, exhalation. Ruth Memupha returned to Babylon. The celebration was not only a moment of joy, but also a declaration of trust in the God who had led them out of Egypt. Though challenges lay ahead, this night marked a turning point, a time to rejoice in their identity as God's chosen people. The wilderness brought challenges that tested the faith of the Israelites. As supplies dwindled, murmurs of doubt arose within the camp. "What shall we eat?" the people asked Moses, their voices tinged with worry. Moses turned to God in prayer, his heart heavy with concern for the people he led. That evening, as the camp rested under the blanket of night, they awoke to find manna, a fine, flaky substance, covering the ground. The people gathered the manna with amazement, tasting its sweetness and marveling at God's provision. "This is the bread the Lord has given us to eat," Moses explained, reminding them of God's faithfulness. Each bite of manna became a reminder that the God who delivered them from Egypt would continue to sustain them. As the days turned into weeks, the Israelites began to grasp the depth of their dependence on God. The journey through the wilderness was not just about reaching the promised land. It was about learning to trust the one who led them. Each evening, the pillar of fire appeared, a comforting reminder of God's presence. Each morning, the manna provided nourishment for the day ahead. Slowly, the people's faith grew, replacing the fear and doubt that had once consumed them. Moses often sat in quiet contemplation, marveling at God's patience and grace. He reminded the people, "The Lord is teaching us to trust Him, to rely on Him for everything. He is shaping us into a nation that will reflect His glory." The Israelites carried these words in their hearts, finding strength in the covenant God had made with them. As they journeyed further, the Israelites set aside a night to remember the events of the first Passover. Families gathered within their tents, retelling the story of the lamb's blood, the angel of death, and their miraculous deliverance from Egypt. The children listened intently, their eyes wide with wonder. "Why do we eat unleavened bread?" they asked, curious about the significance of the meal. "To remind us of the night God delivered us," parents explained, breaking the bread and sharing it with their children. "We left Egypt in haste, with no time to let the bread rise. This bread is a symbol of God's power and faithfulness." The remembrance was solemn yet hopeful, a time to honor the past and look forward to the future. The Israelites pledged to keep this tradition alive, ensuring that every generation would know the story of God's deliverance. The Israelites camped under a star-filled sky, the cool breeze carrying the distant sounds of laughter and song. Moses stood at the edge of the camp, gazing at the pillar of fire that illuminated the night. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for all that God had done and a renewed hope for the journey ahead. The people rested, their hearts filled with peace. They had left Egypt behind, not just physically, but spiritually. Though the path to the promised land stretched ahead with its uncertainties, they knew they were not alone. As the first light of dawn appeared, Moses rose early and called the people together. "Let us continue in faith," he said. "The Lord, who brought us out of Egypt, will bring us into the land He has promised. He is faithful, and His love endures forever." The Israelites lifted their voices in a song of praise, their hearts united in trust. Together, they stepped forward into the wilderness, knowing that their God would guide them every step of the way. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. Exodus 13:21. The wilderness stretched out before the Israelites, a vast and untamed expanse of golden sands and jagged hills, where the sun blazed mercilessly during the day and the nights descended into a still and cool hush. On this first evening of their journey, a sense of awe mingled with uncertainty settled over the camp. Families huddled together, their gazes fixed on the horizon, where a brilliant pillar of fire now danced against the darkening sky. Moses stood among them, his staff firmly planted in the ground. His voice was steady as he reminded the people of God's promise to guide and protect them. "This fire is not just a light in the darkness," he declared. "It is the very presence of the Lord, leading us on the path He has prepared." As the night deepened, the Israelites set up their makeshift tents. The pillar of fire blazed brightly above, casting a warm glow across the camp. The children marveled at its beauty, their laughter breaking the stillness, while the adults whispered prayers of gratitude and trust. With the fire illuminating their way, fear of the unknown began to melt away, replaced by the calm assurance of God's guidance. The stars shone brilliantly overhead, but their light paled in comparison to the fiery beacon. The vast wilderness felt less foreboding under the pillar of fire. Its radiant glow danced across the sands, turning the desert into a canvas of light and shadow. For the Israelites, this miraculous sight served as a tangible reminder of God's presence. Mothers hummed lullabies to their children, their melodies blending with the crackle of the distant fire, while elders sat in small circles, recounting the wonders God had already performed. Moses, seated near his tent, gazed at the flame with quiet reverence. He thought of the God who had called him from the burning bush, whose voice had assured him of this very moment. Beside him, Aaron joined in silent prayer, their hearts united in gratitude and trust. As the hours passed, the people rested peacefully, the fire guarding them like a watchful sentinel. Even the wilderness creatures seemed subdued, their movements cautious under the holy light. The desert, so often a place of danger, became a sanctuary as the Lord's presence transformed fear into peace. Morning arrived, and with it, the pillar of fire faded into a pillar of cloud. The transition was seamless, a reminder of God's unchanging faithfulness. As the Israelites dismantled their tents and prepared to move, the cloud hovered ahead, waiting patiently. Children pointed excitedly as the cloud shifted, leading them forward. "God is showing us the way," they cried. Parents smiled, their hearts swelling with hope. The path was uneven, with rocks and slopes to navigate, but the cloud never strayed. When the heat of the day became oppressive, the cloud offered shade. Its presence was both practical and divine, providing relief and direction. As the journey continued, the people found themselves marveling not just at the miracle before them, but at the God who cared so deeply for their every need. As night fell once more, the cloud dissolved into the familiar pillar of fire. Its brilliance was a comfort after the day's laborious trek. The camp settled into its rhythm. Fires crackled, meals were prepared, and prayers were spoken. Among the travelers was a young boy named Eliab, who tugged at his father's sleeve. "Why does the fire never go out?" he asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Because God is always with us," his father replied, pulling him close. "The fire shows us His love and protection. As long as it burns, we can trust that He is guiding us." Eliab nodded, his heart swelling with awe. That night, as he drifted to sleep, he dreamed of a great flame enveloping the desert, driving away the darkness forever. The wilderness tested the Israelites in many ways. Supplies dwindled, tempers flared, and doubts crept in. Yet through it all, the pillar of fire remained steadfast. It was a beacon of hope, a reminder that the God who had delivered them from Egypt would not abandon them now. One night, as the camp faced a particularly cold wind, the fire seemed to burn brighter. Families huddled closer, drawing warmth not just from its heat, but from the assurance it represented. Moses walked among the people, speaking words of encouragement. "Do not fear," he said. "The Lord is with us. His light will not fade, and his promises will not fail." The Israelites grew accustomed to the rhythm of their journey, the cloud by day and the fire by night. With each passing mile, their trust in God deepened. The fire was more than a light. It was a symbol of their covenant with him. On one particularly quiet evening, Miriam led the women in a song of praise. Her voice soared above the murmurs of the camp, her lyrics a tribute to the God who walked before them. Soon, others joined in, their voices rising together in harmonious worship. The pillar of fire seemed to flicker in response, its light pulsing with the rhythm of their song. The moment was holy, a glimpse of the divine connection between God and his people. The wilderness was more than a place of travel. It was a place of transformation. Each night, as the pillar of fire burned brightly, it seemed to whisper lessons of trust and dependence into the hearts of the Israelites. The people were learning that God's guidance was not only about the destination, but about shaping their faith along the way. Moses often stood quietly near the pillar, his silhouette illuminated by the flickering light. His thoughts were a mixture of gratitude and awe. "O Lord," he prayed one night, "you are our guide and our teacher. May we learn to trust in your ways, even when the path seems uncertain." "We shall find them." The fire danced as if in response, its warmth a gentle reassurance. The people began to see the fire as more than a light. It was a symbol of God's presence and their covenant with him. Under the glow of the pillar, families found moments of peace and reflection. In one corner of the camp, a father shared the story of the pillar with his children. "This fire," he explained, "is not just for light. It reminds us that God is with us, guiding and protecting us." The children listened, their wide eyes reflecting the flame. "Why does the fire never go out?" one of them asked. "Because God's love for us never ends," the father replied, pulling his youngest close. "He is our everlasting guide, lighting the way through every dark night." The children drifted to sleep that evening with hearts full of wonder, dreaming of the God who walked before them. The wilderness nights were often cold and unsettling, with the distant howls of wild animals echoing through the desert. But the pillar of fire was a constant source of comfort. Its light seemed to create an invisible shield around the camp, warding off the darkness and any lurking dangers. One particularly frigid night, a young mother wrapped her infant tightly in a cloth and approached the edge of the camp, where the fire's glow was strongest. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude. "Thank you, Lord, for your protection and warmth," she said softly. Then she closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude. As she returned to her tent, she felt a deep peace settle over her. The fire wasn't just a physical light. It was a divine reminder of God's nearness. The fire brought the Israelites together, fostering a sense of unity in the vast wilderness. As they gathered each evening around its glow, it was as if the light itself knit their hearts together. One evening, after a long and tiring day of travel, disputes broke out over limited supplies. Frustration and tempers flared until Moses intervened. Standing near the pillar of fire, he called for calm. "This light is a reminder of God's presence among us," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "Let it also remind us to be patient and kind with one another, for we are his people." The fire flickered as Moses spoke, its warm light bathing the crowd. Slowly, the tension eased, replaced by the shared understanding that they were all part of God's chosen nation. As the journey continued, the Israelites began to see the fire as a promise. It wasn't merely a guide. It was a declaration of God's unwavering commitment to his people. One evening, Miriam stood near the pillar, her heart swelling with praise. She began to sing softly, her voice carrying over the quiet camp. Her song was a simple melody of gratitude, a hymn to the God who had led them this far. Others joined in, their voices weaving together in harmony. The fire seemed to respond, its light pulsing gently with the rhythm of their worship. In that moment, the camp felt like holy ground, a place where heaven and earth touched. That night, as the people drifted into restful sleep, their hearts were filled with a deep assurance. The God who had brought them this far would not abandon them. The pillar of fire stood steadfast, a beacon of hope in the wilderness. The pillar of fire had become a steadfast companion, its glow a constant reminder of God's faithfulness. Moses often stood at the edge of the camp, gazing toward the horizon. "Lord," he prayed softly, "you have shown us the way, even when we did not know where to step. Help us to follow you with trust and obedience." The fire flickered gently, as if affirming Moses' words. Its steady presence was a comfort, a sign that no matter how uncertain the path seemed, God was always leading. One evening, the camp settled near a rocky hillside. The day had been grueling, the terrain difficult and water scarce. Some began to question whether the journey was worth the hardship. "Does this fire truly lead us to a better place?" an elder murmured, voicing what others dared not say. Moses gathered the people near the pillar, its glow reflecting on their weary faces. "The Lord has not brought us this far to abandon us," he declared. "This fire is a sign of his covenant, a promise that he walks with us through every trial." The fire flared brighter, casting its light across the crowd. Hearts that had been heavy with doubt were lifted, reminded of God's faithfulness, even in the hardest moments. The wilderness was a place of learning, and the fire was both guide and teacher. Each night, families shared the day's lessons around small campfires, with the great pillar glowing in the distance. The young boy listened intently as his grandfather spoke. This journey is not just about reaching a new land, the elder said. It is about trusting the one who leads us. The fire is a sign of his presence, but his care for us goes even deeper. The boy looked at the pillar, its light reflected in his wide eyes. Will it always stay with us? He asked. As long as we need it, his grandfather replied, his voice full of conviction. A sudden desert storm swept through the camp one evening, with howling winds and swirling sand. The Israelites huddled in their tents, their faith tested by the fierce elements. Through the chaos, the pillar of fire stood unwavering, its light piercing the storm. Moses emerged from his tent, his face resolute. "The Lord is our refuge," he called out, his voice carrying above the wind. This fire is his reminder that he shelters us, even in the fiercest storms. Gradually, the wind subsided, leaving a profound stillness. The fire's warmth seemed to embrace the camp, a tangible sign of God's protection. One particularly peaceful evening, the Israelites gathered near the pillar for a time of worship. The air was cool, and the fire's glow created a serene atmosphere. Miriam led the assembly in a hymn of praise, her voice lifting the hearts of the people. "Great is the Lord, who goes before us and lights our way," she sang. The crowd joined in, their voices rising in harmony. The fire seemed to pulse with the rhythm of their worship, its light dancing in time with their songs. That night, the camp felt like a sanctuary, a place where the presence of God was palpable. The pillar of fire rarely changed, but its steady presence spoke volumes. It was as if God were saying, "I am here. I will not leave you." The pillar of fire simmered with intense power. For a moment, safety. One night, Aaron sat alone, reflecting on the journey. "Lord," he whispered, "you have guided us faithfully. Help me to be faithful in return." The fire burned brightly, a silent yet powerful response. Aaron felt a deep peace wash over him, a reassurance that God's promises were unchanging. As the Israelites prepared to move camp one morning, the fire began to fade, signaling the transition to the cloud of day. But its impact lingered in the hearts of the people. "The fire is more than a light," Moses reminded them as they packed their belongings. "It is a symbol of God's faithfulness, a guiding hand that will never fail us." The people nodded, their spirits renewed. Even as the fire gave way to the cloud, they carried its lessons with them, confident in the one who led them. In the following months and years, the wind softened, and the evening was quiet as the Israelites settled into their camp for another night in the wilderness. The pillar of fire stood tall, its warm light casting shadows across the rugged desert terrain. Moses walked among the tents, offering words of encouragement to his people. "Do you see the fire?" he asked a group of weary travelers. "It is a reminder that we are never alone. God goes before us, even when the way seems uncertain." An elder nodded thoughtfully. "This fire is more than light," he said. "It is a promise." Lit. The fire flickered as if affirming the elder's words, filling the camp with a profound sense of peace. That night, Joshua sat by his small campfire, gazing at the great pillar in the distance. His mind wandered to the future, wondering what challenges lay ahead. "Do you fear what's to come?" Caleb asked, joining him. Joshua shook his head slowly. "Not fear, but a deep sense of responsibility. Yet when I see the fire, I'm reminded of who leads us." "May I marry you?" Caleb smiled, placing a hand on Joshua's shoulder. "As long as we follow the light, we will not lose our way." The fire's glow seemed to intensify, a silent reassurance of God's unchanging guidance. The wilderness nights were often cold, but the pillar of fire brought warmth and comfort to the camp. Families gathered close to its light, finding solace in its steady presence. Jochebed cradled her youngest child, her voice soft as she told him stories of God's faithfulness. "This fire is His way of showing us that He is near," she whispered. The child's eyes widened as he looked toward the pillar. "Is it like His hand, Mama?" he asked. "Ah, yes," Jochebed replied, her heart swelling with gratitude. "It's His hand, holding us close." One evening, the camp was unusually still, the only sounds being the occasional bleating of sheep and the whisper of the wind. The pillar of fire stood unwavering, its light illuminating the path ahead. Moses used the moment to reflect. Kneeling at the edge of the camp, he prayed, "Lord, your light has been our guide and our hope. Help us to remain steadfast in your presence." As he prayed, the fire burned brighter for a moment, as if offering an answer. Moses rose, his heart strengthened for the journey ahead. As the Israelites prepared for another night's rest, Miriam gathered the women for a time of praise and thanksgiving. They sang songs of God's provision, their voices harmonizing with the gentle crackling of the nearby pillar. "Let us never forget His faithfulness," Miriam encouraged, her eyes reflecting the fire's glow. "This light is a reminder of the one who walks with us." The women's songs carried across the camp, lifting the spirits of all who heard. That night, the pillar seemed to burn even brighter, as if joining in their worship. One night, a distant threat loomed on the horizon as raiders approached the camp. Fear spread among the Israelites, but the pillar of fire rose higher, its glow becoming a blazing shield. The raiders hesitated, their courage faltering as they faced the unearthly light. Eventually, they turned back, their shadows retreating into the darkness. The camp erupted in gratitude, their voices raised in praise. "The Lord is our defender," Moses proclaimed. The fire's steady glow seemed to echo his declaration, reminding the people of God's unshakable protection. Morning arrived, and the fire slowly gave way to the cloud that would guide the day's journey. But its lessons lingered in the hearts of the Israelites. As they packed their belongings, Moses addressed the crowd. "This pillar of fire has shown us the way, but it has also taught us to trust in the Lord's presence," he said. A thane slouched against the wall. The people nodded, their spirits renewed. They knew that as long as they followed God's guidance, the path, no matter how difficult, would always lead to His promises. End of poem. The fire's memory remained with them, a beacon of hope as they moved forward in faith. As the journey through the wilderness continued, the Israelites found themselves facing yet another long stretch of desert. The heat of the day had taken its toll, but the night was always a comfort, with the pillar of fire blazing high. That evening, as the people gathered around their campfires, Moses sat alone, deep in thought. His eyes shifted from the fiery pillar to the quiet sky above. He reflected on how the fire had not only provided light and warmth, but also reminded them of God's never-ending presence. "Lord," Moses whispered, "thank you for leading us so faithfully. Let your light continue to guide us, even when our own strength falters and creates room for us in the dark." The fire seemed to glow brighter, its warmth offering comfort and strength in the stillness of the desert night. As the Israelites set up camp once more, a feeling of weariness began to settle over the people. The journey had been long, and the desert seemed endless. But in the distance, the fire burned steadily, offering a familiar presence that calmed their hearts. Deborah, an elder woman, took a moment to sit by the fire with her daughter Leah. "This light is more than a guide," Deborah said softly. "It's a promise. God is with us." Leah looked into the fire, her eyes wide with wonder. "Will He always be with us? Even when we can't see the light?" "Yes," Deborah replied. "Even in the darkest moments, He is with us. The fire is just a reminder." One evening, a heavy storm rolled in, dark clouds covering the sky. The Israelites huddled under their tents, uncertain of what the night would bring. Yet, despite the storm, the pillar of fire stood firm, its light cutting through the rain. It reminded the people that, even in the midst of trials, God's presence would guide them. Daro Cesar Dolmenami. Moses stepped out of his tent and raised his arms toward the fire. "Lord, we trust you in this storm. Lead us through, as you always have." The fire blazed brighter, as if affirming his words, and the storm passed through with only a soft patter of rain, leaving the people with a renewed sense of faith. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the Israelites grew accustomed to the sight of the pillar of fire. It had become more than just a guiding light. It was a symbol of God's unshakable promise. One evening, a young man named Eli approached the fire, his heart troubled by the hardships they had faced. "Will we ever find peace?" he asked Moses. Moses smiled softly, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Peace is not found in the absence of trials, but in the assurance that God is with us through them. This fire, this light, is our reminder that we are never alone. Eli took a deep breath, the weight of his burdens lifting as he felt the warmth of the fire against his skin. It was as though the flame itself offered peace. In the midst of their journey, the days passed, and the Israelites continued their long journey through the wilderness. Though the road was difficult, they had learned to trust in the guidance of the pillar of fire. On one final night, as the fire burned brightly before them, Moses stood among the people. He lifted his hands toward the heavens, his heart full of gratitude. This fire has led us through every trial, and though we may face many more, we will follow the light. The fire blazed even brighter as the people murmured their agreement. Together, they had come to understand that God's light would always lead them, no matter where their journey took them. And as they rested that night, they found peace in knowing that the fire would continue to guide them into the future, a beacon of God's constant love and faithfulness. Behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. Genesis 19:19. End of prayer. In the stillness of the night, Lot stood at the entrance of his home, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on his heart. The angels had warned him. The city of Sodom, with all its corruption and sin, was doomed. But Lot had hesitated. There was so much that he knew he would leave behind. His life, his possessions, the familiar streets that had known his footsteps for years. But in that moment of silence, he felt something else too. God's mercy, offering him a way out. His family gathered quietly, their movements slow and deliberate, as the cool night air brushed against their faces. Lot took a deep breath, feeling the heaviness in his chest lighten, and placed his trust in the God who had sent his messengers to save them. It was not easy to leave, but Lot knew this was the path of safety. The angels had given them one command: escape to Zoar. As they walked, the city of Sodom behind them, the night was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. The stars twinkled overhead, offering a silent promise of peace in the darkness. Lot's heart, though still heavy with sorrow for the city he had left, found some comfort in the fact that he was not alone. God's presence surrounded him. The angels, unseen but ever near, guided their steps along the path. Lot reflected on God's kindness, how he had spared them from the destruction that was unfolding in the cities of the plain. His thoughts turned to the righteousness of Abraham, Lot's uncle, whose prayers had pleaded for the city. Though Lot had been caught in the turmoil, it was Abraham's faith that had made a difference, allowing Lot to be saved. Though the journey ahead was long and uncertain, Lot felt a quiet sense of peace wash over him. God was with him, and that assurance would carry him through whatever lay ahead. As Lot and his family continued their journey through the hills, the land around them seemed unfamiliar, though he had passed this way many times. It was a strange feeling, being in a place that had always felt like home, but now it was different. The air smelled fresher, the hills quieter. The world felt still, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. The road to Zoar was not long, but the darkness made it feel endless. The gentle glow of the stars illuminated their path, but still, the journey seemed slow. Lot's mind wandered again to the destruction of Sodom, remembering the cries of the people as they had tried to flee. Yet, he had not been able to help them. There was nothing he could have done to save the city. Lot paused for a moment and looked back at the silhouette of the city in the distance, now veiled in darkness. He had known it well, and yet he felt no attachment now. God's mercy had spared him. There was no time to linger in the past, only forward could he go. He could feel the weight of the decision that had been made. His wife, silently walking beside him, glanced at him, her face showing the same sense of loss and uncertainty. Lot could see it in her eyes. She missed the life they had known, the comforts they had enjoyed. But the urgency of the moment was evident in her silence. The angels had urged them not to look back. They walked in quiet companionship, the sound of their footsteps soft in the night. Lot could feel the reassurance of God's hand guiding them, leading them safely through the night. There was no fear, no panic, just the peaceful sense that they were walking in the direction God had chosen for them. As they approached the foothills leading to Zoar, Lot paused to take in the view of the land below. The rolling hills stretched out beneath the endless sky, and he could see the faint outline of the town ahead. But as he looked at it, something in him stirred, a longing for the city that was now gone. But it was not the physical city that he missed. It was the life he had lived there. Lot had spent so many years building a life in Sodom, a place that had once felt like home. The bustling markets, the friendships, the comforts of living in a city with great wealth and influence. Yet as he looked toward Zoar, he realized that all that he had left behind was merely fleeting. The things of this world were temporary, but God's promises were eternal. Lord, he whispered, thank you for your mercy. Thank you for sparing me and my family. I trust that you will lead us where we need to go. A gentle breeze rustled the trees, and in that moment, Lot felt a quiet peace. God had saved him from destruction, and in this moment, Lot was free from the worries of his past. There was no longer any need for him to look back. He could move forward with hope, knowing that God's plans for him were good. As the family approached Zoar, Lot felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The night, once filled with uncertainty, now felt full of possibilities. He had been given a new beginning, a chance to start fresh, and with God's guidance, he would walk into that future with peace in his heart. And on a winter's night, God was always there for that. The journey was long, but as Lot and his family approached the gates of Zoar, the weight of the past seemed to lift from their shoulders. They could see the small town ahead, its buildings nestled quietly against the hills, bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight. The once heavy silence now felt like a gentle embrace, welcoming them into the safety that lay beyond the town's gates. The angels had guided them faithfully through the darkness, and now, as they reached Zoar, Lot was filled with a deep sense of gratitude. He could almost feel God's presence surrounding them, a protection that had been with them every step of the way. The town was small, but it felt like a sanctuary, a place of peace and rest after their long, harrowing escape. Lot's heart was still heavy with the destruction of Sodom, but it was also full of thanks for God's mercy, for his protection, and for the promise that they would be safe. The familiar sense of uncertainty that had gripped him throughout the journey began to fade, replaced by a quiet trust that God was in control, even in the midst of chaos and fear. "Lord, we have arrived," Lot prayed softly, looking up to the stars above. "You have brought us here safely, and for that I am thankful. I trust in your plans for us, and I will wait for your guidance in this new place." After their long journey, Lot and his family settled into a modest home in Zoar. The air was cool, and the stillness of the night wrapped around them like a blanket. The world outside was quiet, save for the soft chirp of crickets and the rustle of the trees. Inside, the warmth of a small fire flickered gently, casting shadows on the walls. As Lot sat by the fire, his mind wandered back to the events that had led them here. The destruction of Sodom, the urgency of the angel's message, the long journey through the night. But now, in this quiet town, there was a sense of peace. The danger was behind them, and for the first time in a long while, Lot felt like he could rest. His thoughts shifted from the past to the present, and then to the future. What would their life be like here? What did God have in store for them in this small town? As he sat there in the stillness, Lot found comfort in the simple thought that God had led them here. It was not a grand place, but it was a place of refuge. And in that refuge, Lot could find rest. His family could find peace, and together they could begin to rebuild, trusting in God's provision every step of the way. As Lot sat outside, gazing at the stars that stretched endlessly above him, he was filled with awe at the vastness of God's creation. The same stars that had shone over Sodom now filled the night sky over Zoar. The heavens, in all their beauty, were a constant reminder of God's presence. And in the quiet of the night, Lot could hear the whispers of God's faithfulness. "Lord, you have been faithful to me," Lot whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "In the midst of the destruction, you spared my life. You guided me safely here, and I trust that you will continue to guide us." The peace of the moment wrapped around him like a warm embrace. The city he had known was gone, but God's presence was with him still. And in that moment, Lot realized that it was not the city that had provided security. It was God. He was the true source of peace. He thought about the mercy God had shown him, how he had saved him despite his own shortcomings. Lot was not perfect, but God had been merciful. And in the stillness of the night, Lot's heart swelled with gratitude. Elausus was his father. He loved him and he warriored. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, "for your great mercy and for your kindness and saving me." As the night stretched on, Lot continued to reflect on the journey that had brought him here. The night seemed to stretch endlessly, but in the silence he felt a deep sense of renewal. The past was behind him, and the future, though uncertain, was full of hope. Lot had been given a second chance, a chance to start fresh, to rebuild, and to live in peace. God had shown him mercy, not just by saving him from the destruction of Sodom, but by bringing him to Zoar, a place where he could heal and rebuild his life. God had shown him mercy and a chance to start fresh, to rebuild and rebuild his life. He thought about his family, about how they had walked together through the night, how they had trusted God's guidance. And now, here in Zoar, they had a chance to make a new life. It would not be easy, but Lot trusted that God would provide. And with that trust, Lot fell asleep, his heart at peace. The angels had guided him safely to Zoar, and God's hand was upon him. In the stillness of the night, he knew that God's promises were sure, and that no matter what the future held, God would always be with him. The first light of morning gently broke through the horizon, casting soft hues of pink and gold over the land. Lot awoke to the quiet beauty of the new day, feeling the warmth of the sun kiss his skin. The events of the previous night, fleeing Sodom, seeking refuge in Zoar, seemed like a distant dream, but the peace in his heart felt very real. He stepped outside into the stillness of the early morning, his feet brushing the cool earth as he looked around at the small town that now represented his new beginning. Zoar was modest, but there was a sense of calm here that soothed his weary soul. It was not the bustling, prosperous city of Sodom, but it was a place where he could breathe again, where God's mercy had brought him and his family to safety. Lot offered a prayer of thanks to God for this new day, for the safety of his family, and for the refuge that Zoar provided. He thought about how God had led him here with such precision, even through the darkest night. He could now see the hand of God in every detail of the journey. Lord, thank you for this day, for your mercy and for bringing us to this place of peace, Lot whispered, his heart full of gratitude. I trust that you will lead us in the days ahead, and I will follow your guidance. As the day unfolded, Lot took time to walk through Zoar and see the land that would be his home now. The town, though small, seemed to hold a quiet strength. The homes were simple, and the people went about their daily tasks with a peaceful determination. Lot had much to do. He needed to rebuild his life, his family's life. But he knew that the process would take time. The land was fertile, and with God's blessing, it could be cultivated. He could build a new life for his children, a life rooted in God's provision and peace. Walking through the town, Lot spoke to the townspeople, offering a friendly greeting and helping where he could. He found that they were kind and open, welcoming him and his family into their community. Though Zoar was a quiet place, there was a sense of unity and goodwill that made Lot feel at ease. He knew, however, that true rebuilding would take more than just physical work. It would require patience, faith, and trust in God's guidance. He and his family had been through much, and the scars of the past would not disappear overnight. But Lot was certain that God was with them, and in that certainty there was hope. As the day wore on, Lot found himself sitting once again outside his home, looking out over the fields that stretched before him. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the land. It was a peaceful scene, the kind of peacefulness that only God could provide. The quiet hum of the earth seemed to match the stillness of his heart, and the low hum of the fields that stretched before him. As the day wore on, Lot thought back to the words of the angels, the urgent call to flee Sodom, and the promise that Zoar would be their refuge. He remembered how, despite the terror and confusion of that night, God had remained faithful. Lord, Lot prayed, I know you are with me. I trust in your promises, and I know that you will continue to guide us here, in this place. I ask that you help us rebuild, not just our homes, but our hearts as well. May this place be a reminder of your faithfulness and mercy. The days passed, and the town of Zoar became a place of peace for Lot and his family. As they settled into their new lives, they found a rhythm that suited them. The work was steady, and the people of Zoar continued to show kindness and support. Lot spent much of his time working the land, teaching his children the ways of God, and slowly integrating into the community. He knew that it would take time to rebuild everything that had been lost, but with each passing day, the pain of Sodom's destruction became a little more distant. In the end, it was the loss of Jerusalem that provided the means to turn her own fate and take. His family, too, began to heal. The trauma of the past still lingered in their hearts, but they could see that God's hand was at work. They found peace in the little things: shared meals, quiet conversations, and the beauty of the land around them. It was not the life they had once known, but it was a life of peace, and that peace was a gift from God. One evening, as Lot sat with his wife and children around a simple meal, he looked at them with gratitude. The past had been full of uncertainty and fear, but now, in this small town, he could see the beginning of a new chapter. His family was together, safe, and beginning to rebuild. God has been so good to us, Lot said softly, looking around the table. Though we have lost much, we have gained so much more: peace, safety, and each other. He said. His wife smiled, her eyes filled with the quiet strength that had carried them through the darkest times. I believe that God has something good for us here, Lot. Though we may never fully understand why we had to leave Sodom, I trust that his plans for us are better than anything we could have imagined. Lot nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace. They were safe now. They were together. And as long as they trusted in God's guidance, they knew they would be okay. In the days that followed, Lot spent much time in prayer, seeking God's guidance for the future. He had learned that life could change in an instant, that the things he had once relied on were no longer certain. But through it all, he had seen God's unwavering faithfulness. He knew that no matter what the future held, God would always be with him. Lot's trusting God deepened. He knew that even though Zoar was not his home forever, it was where God had placed him for now. And that was enough. Kahun Meonar, Lord, Lot prayed one evening as the sun set behind the hills. I trust that your plan for me is good. I trust that you will continue to lead me and my family in this new chapter of our lives. May your peace fill our hearts, and may we always seek your will in everything we do. As the days turned into weeks, Lot found that the quietness of Zoar was both a comfort and a challenge. It was a peace unlike any he had ever known, and yet it was a peace that came with a deep responsibility. He had seen the destruction of Sodom, and although Zoar was far smaller, he could not help but feel the weight of God's judgment upon the world. The nights in Zoar were still and dark, a stark contrast to the noise and bustle of Sodom, with its weak sense of stability. As the days turned into weeks, and by the way the moon was peaceful and dark, as the days turned into weeks, and by the months turned into years, and still, Lot often sat outside at night, gazing at the stars above, listening to the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. It was in these moments of solitude that he reflected on God's mercy and his presence, even in places like Zoar, where life had begun anew. The memories of Sodom's fall were still fresh, but the peace of the moment reminded him of God's sovereign control over all things. Lord, Lot whispered into the night, you brought us here for a reason. Please guide us, and may your peace remain in our hearts always. The morning sun rose over Zoar with a golden glow, casting a soft light across the land. Lot woke early, as he often did, to witness the beauty of God's creation. As he stepped outside, the cool morning air greeted him, and he couldn't help but marvel at the newness of the world around him. Despite the trials they had faced, his family was together, and the land provided. There was hope, even in this small town. Lot took a moment to walk to the nearby fields, where he could feel the earth beneath his feet. The soil was rich, the crops were growing well, and the peace he felt in his heart was beginning to transform the land. He knew that his work in Zoar was just beginning, but the Lord had already shown him the path ahead. I will trust in you, Lord, Lot prayed as he stood still, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. You have brought us this far, and I know you will see us through every step. One afternoon, as Lot was returning from his work in the fields, he saw a figure walking toward him. It was a man dressed in travel-worn clothes, with a look of quiet determination. As the man approached, Lot greeted him with kindness. "Welcome to Zoar, traveler," Lot said. "You must be weary from your journey." The man smiled softly, but there was a heaviness in his eyes. "I am indeed weary," he said, "and I seek refuge in your town. I have heard of the mercy of this place." "The mercy of this place?" I shrugged. Lot nodded, understanding the unspoken meaning in the man's words. He knew what it was like to need mercy, to seek a place of peace after great loss. "You are welcome here," Lot said. "We find peace in the presence of the Lord. Come, rest for a while." As the man settled into a seat by the fire, Lot listened intently. The stranger shared a tale of hardship, of loss and uncertainty, much like his own. In this moment, Lot realized that he was not alone in his suffering. Others too were seeking refuge and peace. "May God bless you and bring you rest," Lot said with a warm smile. "There is always hope in him." As the stranger spent the evening in Zoar, Lot sat once again under the stars, his heart filled with gratitude. The small town had become a place of refuge for many, and it was clear to him that God was at work in ways he could not always see. He thought back to the first night he had arrived, the fear that had gripped him, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. But now, as he looked out over the peaceful land, he saw that God's hand had led them to a place of safety and restoration. It was not a perfect place, but it was a place of peace, and that was enough. "Lord," Lot prayed softly, "thank you for your mercy, for your protection. You have been faithful to us in ways we cannot comprehend. May your peace continue to reign in our hearts, and may we always remember your goodness." The seasons continued to change, and Zoar flourished. Lot's family settled into their new life with growing peace. The fields were plentiful, and the people of Zoar were kind and supportive. Lot spent his days working alongside the townsfolk, helping where he could and finding moments to reflect on all that God had done for him and his family. One evening, as the family gathered for supper, Lot looked around at his children, his wife, and the peace that now surrounded them. There was still much work to be done, but the Lord had been faithful to them, and that was enough. He felt a deep sense of gratitude well up inside him. "God has been so good to us," Lot said, his voice full of emotion. "We've been through much, but here we are, together, safe. I am grateful for his provision, for his mercy, and for the love he has shown us." His wife smiled, her eyes reflecting the same gratitude. "He has been our strength, Lot. His peace is what has carried us through." As time passed, Lot began to feel a deeper sense of peace. His heart, once filled with fear and uncertainty, had slowly been healed by the Lord's presence. The land of Zoar, small though it was, had become a place where he could rest, knowing that God was with him. He began to speak to the people of Zoar about his journey, about the mercy of God and the importance of trusting in him, even in the darkest times. Lot's words resonated with the people, and they too began to grow in their faith. The town of Zoar became a place where the Lord's peace was sought and found, a beacon of hope for those in need of refuge. One evening, as Lot sat by the fire with his family, he marveled at the transformation that had taken place. He had lost much, but in return, God had given him so much more: peace, community, and a renewed sense of purpose. "Thank you, Lord," Lot prayed, "for this new beginning. May your peace continue to guide us in every step. Years passed, and Lot's family flourished in Zoar. The town had grown, and though it remained a small place, it had become known as a place of peace and refuge. Lot's story, his journey of loss and restoration, was shared with the next generation, who learned from his example of trusting in God's provision. As Lot grew older, he found peace in knowing that his life had been a testimony of God's mercy. The town that had once seemed so foreign to him had become home, and the trials he had faced had shaped him into a man of faith. His children and grandchildren were raised in the knowledge of God's goodness and faithfulness, and they carried that legacy forward. One final evening, as Lot sat by the fire, he looked up at the stars, remembering how he had once fled the destruction of Sodom and found refuge in Zoar. Now his heart was at rest. He knew that the peace of God had not only healed his life, but had also become a legacy for those who would come after him. Lord, he prayed softly, thank you for all you have done. You have brought peace to my heart, and I pray that your peace will continue to reign in this land for generations to come. End of prayer. Laughter. Years passed, and Lot's life in Zoar settled into a peaceful rhythm. He watched his children grow, marrying and starting families of their own. The small town continued to thrive, and Lot often found himself giving thanks for the quiet beauty of his new life. Every day, he could feel the presence of God, like a steady, comforting hand on his shoulder, reminding him that his journey was not in vain. Sometimes, when the sun was low in the sky, Lot would walk down to the quiet banks of the river near Zoar, taking in the peaceful stillness. He had seen much in his lifetime, both destruction and redemption, and the river's tranquil flow became a symbol of God's enduring mercy and faithfulness. In those moments, Lot would often reflect on how far he had come. The painful memories of Sodom seemed distant now, overshadowed by the peace that God had given him in Zoar. But still, he remembered, Lord, you have shown me more mercy than I deserve, he would pray. Thank you for leading me here, for the peace you've given, and for the family I have. End quote. One autumn evening, a weary traveler appeared at the gates of Zoar. His clothes were dusted with the dirt of the road, and his face bore the marks of a long journey. As he approached the town, Lot noticed him immediately. With a heart full of compassion, Lot welcomed him, offering the stranger food, rest, and shelter for the night. The man accepted gratefully, and over a simple meal by the fire, Lot and the traveler spoke of many things. The traveler shared stories of distant lands, of hardships faced, and of victories won. Lot, in turn, shared his own story, the story of a man who had once fled the city of his life's turmoil, only to find peace in a small town called Zoar. As they spoke, Lot realized how much he had grown through the years. The lessons he had learned through his trials had shaped him into a man who sought to bless others, just as God had blessed him. After their meal, the traveler paused, looking into the fire with a thoughtful gaze. You've experienced much, haven't you? He asked. Lot nodded, his eyes softening. Yes, but I've also learned that peace comes in places we least expect. The traveler stayed for several days, and as the days passed, he and Lot grew closer, exchanging wisdom and ideas. The man spoke of distant lands, but Lot noticed that his words held an air of mystery, a hint that he might not be just an ordinary traveler. One evening, as the two sat together under the starlit sky, the traveler spoke of deep things, of faith, and of God's hand in shaping the destiny of all men. As they watched, Lot, the traveler said gently, "You have experienced both judgment and mercy. Do you not see that your life is part of a greater story? A story that continues long after you are gone." Lot pondered these words, feeling their weight in his heart. He had always known that God was with him, but now he began to understand more fully the vastness of God's plan. It was not just about Zoar, or even his own family. It was about the world, and how each person played a part in God's story. "I understand," Lot whispered. "God's hand is in all things, and I am but a small part of his greater plan." As the years continued to pass, Lot found himself increasingly at peace in Zoar. The town had become a beacon of hope for others, a refuge for those seeking shelter from the storms of life. It was a place where God's peace was not just spoken of, but lived out, day by day. One evening, as Lot walked through the streets of Zoar, he stopped to observe the people around him, families laughing, children playing, and old friends gathered together. The town had become a community of faith and peace, and it was clear that God had blessed it beyond measure. "Thank you, Lord," Lot prayed silently. "This is the life you've given us, and it is enough." Lot's children, now grown, took on more responsibilities in Zoar, continuing the work their father had begun. They had learned from his example, and, as they did so, the town flourished even more. Lot could see how his legacy of peace was being passed on to the next generation. One evening, as Lot sat with his grandchildren, he realized how far he had come. The wounds of the past had healed, and the hope of the future was bright. His heart was full as he looked at the faces of his family, the children who would carry his story forward. "Your grandfather has walked a long road," Lot said softly to his grandchildren. "But I want you to remember this. No matter how difficult the road may seem, God's peace is always with us." Lot grew older, and though his steps were slower, his heart remained steadfast. He continued to visit the riverbank in the evenings, watching the peaceful flow of the water. The stars above reminded him of the many nights he had spent under their light, praying for peace and understanding. As he sat one final time by the river, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment in his heart. The life he had built in Zoar, the peace he had found in his heart, and the legacy of faith he had passed on to his children were all part of God's greater plan. "Lord," he prayed, "you have been faithful. I trust in you, now and always." That night, as Lot lay down to sleep, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. a peace that surpassed all understanding. He had fought many battles, both physical and spiritual, but now he knew that the greatest battle had been won, the battle for his heart. Lot had learned that true peace comes not from the absence of hardship, but from the presence of God. As he closed his eyes, Lot felt the comfort of God's presence, knowing that his work on earth was complete. "Thank you, Lord, for all that you have given me," he whispered as he drifted into a peaceful sleep. Lot's life was celebrated by his family and the people of Zoar. His story was told and retold, not as one of escape, but as one of redemption and peace. His journey from Sodom to Zoar had been marked by faith, and through it all, Lot had learned to trust in God's plan. His children and grandchildren carried on the legacy of peace and faith, continuing to live in the light of God's love and mercy. Zoar remained a place of refuge for many, and it was clear that Lot's life had made an eternal impact on the town. Before his passing, Lot shared one final lesson with his family and the people of Zoar. He reminded them that God's peace was not just for a moment, but for a lifetime. It was a peace that could not be shaken by circumstances or trials, a peace that only came from trusting in God's sovereignty, wherein we safe lie. Matthew 19:4. "God's peace will always be with you," Lot said, his voice full of wisdom. No matter what happens in this life, his peace will guide you home. And so, Lot's life came to a peaceful close. He passed away quietly, surrounded by his loved ones, his legacy of faith and peace, forever etched in the hearts of those who knew him. As the people of Zoar gathered to mourn, they also celebrated Lot's life, a life that had been lived in the peace of God's presence. And in that peace, they found comfort, knowing that God's promise of rest was eternal.